The capture and the mistake. Dr. Sarah Chen stood at the observation deck of the orbital research station, watching Earth turn slowly below. Her reflection in the reinforced glass showed a woman in her early 30s with sharp, intelligent eyes and hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore the standard blue uniform of the Earth Defense Research Division, but the small quantum processor badge on her collar marked her as something special. Sarah was one of humanity's leading experts in quantum engineering and advanced defensive systems. The morning had started normally enough. Sarah was reviewing her latest research on adaptive shield technology when the alerts began flooding her workstation. Long-range sensors had detected something unprecedented. A massive fleet of unknown vessels had appeared at the edge of the solar system. The ships were enormous, each one dwarfing Earth's largest space stations, and they moved with a precision that spoke of advanced technology far beyond anything humanity currently possessed. Within hours, the aliens had sent a communication. They called themselves the Korthak Empire, and they claimed to be representatives of galactic civilization. Their message was polite but firm. Earth would be evaluated for integration into their expanding territory. A delegation of human leaders was invited aboard their flagship for what they termed diplomatic discussions. Sarah had been selected as part of the delegation due to her expertise in advanced technology. The theory was simple. If these aliens wanted to discuss Earth's technological capabilities, having their best scientists present would be advantageous. Admiral Maria Santos, commander of Earth's Defense Force, had personally requested Sarah's participation. The plan seemed straightforward and diplomatic. The Korthak flagship was a marvel of engineering that stretched for kilometers in every direction. Its hull gleamed with an almost organic sheen, and energy patterns danced across its surface like living lightning. When the human shuttle docked, Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. This was first contact with an advanced alien civilization, the kind of moment that would reshape human understanding of the universe. Commander Vex Korthak greeted the human delegation in what appeared to be a ceremonial chamber. He stood nearly 3 meters tall, with gray-blue skin covered in intricate patterns that seemed to shift in the light. His forearms moved with graceful precision, and his large, multifaceted eyes studied the humans with obvious intelligence. When he spoke, his words were translated by technology so advanced that Sarah couldn't detect any delay or distortion. "Welcome, representatives of Earth," Commander Korthak said, his voice carrying tones that suggested both authority and mild amusement. "We have observed your species for some time and find you interesting. Your technological development shows promise, though it remains quite primitive by galactic standards." The diplomatic meeting proceeded for several hours. The Korthak presented themselves as benevolent administrators of a vast interstellar empire. They spoke of bringing Earth into their sphere of influence, sharing advanced technology, and guiding humanity toward its proper place in galactic civilization. Their terms seemed reasonable on the surface. Earth would maintain local autonomy while accepting Korthak oversight of military and advanced research activities. Sarah listened carefully to every word, but something felt wrong. The aliens spoke about humanity with the casual tone of people discussing livestock. Their questions focused heavily on Earth's population, industrial capacity, and resource extraction capabilities. When they asked about her own research, their interest seemed less scientific and more acquisitive. The trap was sprung with surgical precision. During what appeared to be a routine tour of the ship's scientific facilities, the human delegation was separated into smaller groups. Sarah found herself in a laboratory with Dr. Zilth, the Korthak head scientist. Zilth was smaller than Commander Korthak, but moved with the quick, precise motions of someone accustomed to working with dangerous materials. "Your quantum research is quite fascinating," Dr. Zilth said, studying Sarah with those unsettling compound eyes. "We would like to learn more about your methods. Perhaps you would be willing to remain here as our guest while your colleagues return to Earth with our proposal." Sarah's training kicked in immediately. The phrasing was polite, but the underlying threat was clear. This wasn't a request. She noticed that the chamber they were in had sealed itself, and the other humans were nowhere to be seen. "I appreciate the invitation," she said carefully, "but I think it would be better if I returned with the rest of the delegation." Dr. Zilth made a sound that might have been laughter. I'm afraid that won't be possible. You see, we have studied your species extensively. Humans show remarkable adaptability and creativity, but you lack the discipline necessary for proper integration into galactic society. However, with the right modifications, you could become quite useful. The gas that flooded the chamber was odorless and worked almost instantly. Sarah felt her consciousness fading even as she tried to process what Dr. Zilth had said. Her last coherent thought was a mixture of anger and determination. Whatever these aliens planned, they had made a serious mistake in choosing her as their victim. Sarah woke up in a containment cell that looked more like a laboratory than a prison. The walls were transparent aluminum, and she could see banks of sophisticated equipment surrounding her on all sides. Dr. Zilth was working at a control station nearby, occasionally glancing at her with what she was learning to recognize as Korthak satisfaction. "Ah, you're awake," Dr. Zilth said without looking up from his work. "Excellent. We were concerned that human physiology might not respond well to our sedatives, but you appear to have suffered no ill effects." Sarah stood up carefully, testing her balance and checking her condition. She felt normal, though there was a strange metallic taste in her mouth. "What did you do to me? Where are the others?" "Your colleagues have been returned to Earth with our generous offer of partnership," Dr. Zilth replied. "You, however, have been selected for a much more important role. You will help us understand human creativity and problem-solving capabilities." The containment cell was more sophisticated than it initially appeared. Sarah's engineering mind automatically began cataloging its features: energy barriers, atmospheric controls, monitoring systems, and what appeared to be some kind of neural interface technology. The aliens had clearly put considerable thought into designing a prison that could hold a potentially dangerous scientist. Over the next several days, Dr. Zilth conducted a series of what he called evaluations. Sarah was presented with various technological puzzles and engineering challenges, always under the watchful eyes of Korthak guards. She quickly realized that these weren't tests of her knowledge, but attempts to map her thought processes and problem-solving methods. "Fascinating," Dr. Zilth murmured after Sarah had solved a particularly complex energy distribution problem. "Your approach is completely different from standard galactic methodologies. You use intuition and creative leaps where we would rely on systematic analysis." Sarah kept her responses minimal, but she was learning as much about the Korthak as they were learning about her. Their technology was indeed advanced, but it was also highly standardized and rigid. Everything followed precise protocols and established procedures. There seemed to be little room for innovation or creative thinking in their approach to problem solving. The real shock came when Dr. Zilth announced his true intentions. "We have decided to proceed with the replication process," he said casually, as if discussing the weather. "Your unique cognitive patterns will be extremely valuable once we can mass produce them." Sarah felt her blood turn cold. "You're talking about cloning." "A crude term, but essentially accurate," Dr. Zilth agreed. "We will create multiple copies of your consciousness and neural patterns. Each copy will retain your problem-solving abilities while being properly conditioned for obedience and loyalty to the Empire." The cloning facility was a testament to Korthak technological superiority. The main chamber contained dozens of biopods, each one capable of creating a perfect physical copy of any biological specimen. The neural duplication equipment was even more impressive, using quantum field generators to map and recreate the complex patterns of consciousness itself. Sarah was forced to watch as tissue samples were taken from her body and fed into the biosynthesis machines. The process was efficient and apparently painless, but she felt violated in a way that went beyond physical discomfort. These aliens were treating her like a piece of technology to be reverse-engineered and mass-produced. "The physical replication will be complete in approximately 12 of your hours," Dr. Zilth explained with obvious pride. "The neural imprinting process is more complex, but we expect to have a fully functional copy within 2 standard days." What Dr. Zilth didn't understand was that Sarah had been using those days of observation and testing to study the Korthak systems with the same intensity they were studying her. Her quantum engineering background gave her insights into their technology that the aliens couldn't have anticipated. She began to see patterns in their energy distributions, weaknesses in their containment systems, and most importantly, fundamental flaws in their understanding of human consciousness. The first clone began to show signs of consciousness ahead of schedule. Sarah watched through her cell's transparent walls as the biopod opened and her exact duplicate sat up, looking around with obvious confusion. The clone's first words were spoken in perfect English, despite never having learned the language. Where am I?" the clone asked, her voice identical to Sarah's own. Dr. Zilth was beside himself with excitement. "Remarkable. The neural patterns have transferred completely. The clone retains full linguistic capabilities and appears to have access to the original's memories." But Sarah noticed something that Dr. Zilth missed. When the clone looked around the laboratory, her eyes lingered on the same technological details that had caught Sarah's attention. The clone wasn't just a copy of her physical form and memories. She was thinking like an engineer, analyzing the systems around her with the same critical eye that Sarah herself had developed. "The conditioning process can begin immediately," Dr. Zilth announced to his staff. "Once we have confirmed the clone's obedience protocols, we can begin mass production." The conditioning chamber was designed to reshape consciousness itself, using a combination of neural stimulation and psychological manipulation to create compliant, obedient subjects. Sarah watched in horror as her clone was moved into the device, but she also noticed something that filled her with desperate hope. The clone caught her eye through the transparent walls and gave an almost imperceptible nod. Whatever the Korthak thought they understood about human consciousness, they had missed something crucial. The clone wasn't just a copy of Sarah's knowledge and skills. She was Sarah, with all the independence, creativity, and stubborn determination that implied. The conditioning process began with a spectacular light show as energy patterns played across the clone's neural tissue. Dr. Zilth monitored readouts that showed the expected responses: compliance indicators rising, independence markers falling, loyalty parameters aligning with Korthak requirements. What the readouts didn't show was that the clone was consciously resisting the conditioning, while appearing to submit to it. Sarah's knowledge of quantum field theory allowed her duplicate to understand exactly how the neural manipulation worked, and her engineering skills provided the insight needed to create false readings while maintaining her true consciousness. First sign of trouble came when the laboratory's power grid began experiencing minor fluctuations. Dr. Zilth initially dismissed these as normal variations, but Sarah recognized them as something much more significant. The clone was somehow interfacing with the Korthak systems, using the conditioning equipment's neural connections to access the ship's computer networks. "Conditioning process complete," announced the automated system. "Subject shows optimal compliance levels across all parameters." Dr. Zilth approached the conditioning chamber with obvious satisfaction. "Excellent. Clone designation Human Alpha 1, please respond." The clone opened her eyes and looked directly at Dr. Zilth with an expression of perfect obedience. "I am ready to serve the Korthak Empire," she said in a tone devoid of personality or independent thought. But when Dr. Zilth turned away to consult his instruments, the clone looked toward Sarah's cell and winked. The reckoning and revelation, the clone's performance over the next few hours was masterful. She responded to every command with perfect compliance, solved technical problems with impressive efficiency, and showed no signs of independent thought or rebellion. Dr. Zilth was convinced that the conditioning process had been completely successful. "Remarkable," he told his staff as they observed the clone working on a complex engineering problem. "The human retains all of her technical knowledge while showing complete loyalty to our purposes. We can begin preparing for mass production immediately." What Dr. Zilth didn't notice was the pattern of seemingly random commands the clone was entering into the systems she was working on. To the Korthak observers, it looked like efficient problem-solving. To Sarah, watching from her containment cell, it was clearly something much more sophisticated. Her duplicate was methodically mapping the ship's computer networks and identifying critical vulnerabilities. The breakthrough came during the third day of testing. The clone was working on what appeared to be a routine maintenance problem when, She suddenly looked up at Dr. Zilth with an expression of genuine confusion. "Doctor," she said hesitantly, "I'm detecting some unusual energy patterns in the ship's quantum field generators. I think there might be a resonance cascade building up in the primary systems." Dr. Zilth hurried to his monitoring station, his compound eyes widening as he studied the readings. "How is this possible? Our systems don't show any anomalies." "The cascade is building slowly," the clone explained, her voice taking on the confident tone of a technical expert. "It's operating below your normal detection thresholds, but if it continues, you could be looking at a complete system failure within hours." Sarah watched with growing admiration as her duplicate played her role perfectly. The clone was feeding Dr. Zilth just enough real technical information to maintain credibility while subtly manipulating him into making exactly the mistakes she wanted. "Can you correct the problem?" Dr. Zilth asked urgently. "I believe so," the clone replied. "But I'll need access to the primary quantum control systems, and I'll need to work quickly." Within minutes, the clone found herself with unprecedented access to the most critical systems on the ship. Dr. Zilth and his staff watched nervously as she worked, making rapid adjustments to quantum field generators and energy distribution networks. To them, it looked like emergency repairs. In reality, it was the most sophisticated act of sabotage in human history. The clone's modifications were elegant and devastating. She used her knowledge of quantum mechanics to create instabilities that would cascade through the ship's systems in precisely timed sequences. The beauty of her approach was that everything she did appeared to be necessary maintenance work. The Korthak sensors couldn't detect the sabotage because it was hidden within legitimate system operations. "There," the clone announced after several hours of intensive work. "The resonance cascade has been contained. Your system should be stable now." Dr. Zilth checked his readings and nodded with relief. "Excellent work. Your efficiency is remarkable." But Sarah noticed that the clone's eyes were now glowing with an almost imperceptible blue light. The neural interface connections she had, used to access the ship's systems, hadn't been fully disconnected. Instead, the clone had found a way to maintain a permanent link to the Korthak computer networks. The real chaos began at what the ship's chronometer marked as local midnight. Sarah was lying in her cell, appearing to sleep while actually observing everything around her, when the first system failures started. Emergency lights began flashing in corridors throughout the ship, and the steady hum of the life support systems developed an irregular stutter. Dr. Zilth rushed to his control station, frantically checking readings that showed cascading failures throughout the ship's infrastructure. "This is impossible. The repairs were successful. The systems were stable." The clone appeared at his side with an expression of helpful concern. "Doctor, I think I know what's happening. The quantum field modifications I made are interacting with the ship's consciousness mapping technology. There seems to be some kind of feedback loop." Sarah had to admire her duplicate's audacity. The clone was standing right next to Dr. Zilth, offering to help solve the very crisis she had created. And because the conditioning process had convinced the Korthak that she was completely loyal, they never suspected that she might be the source of their problems. "Can you correct it?" Dr. Zilth asked desperately. "I'm not sure," the clone replied, with carefully calculated uncertainty. "The interactions are extremely complex. I might be able to stabilize things, but I'll need access to even more of the ship's core systems." As the hours passed, the situation aboard the Korthak flagship became increasingly desperate. Critical systems were failing in sequence. Life support was becoming unreliable, and the ship's weapons and defensive systems were experiencing random malfunctions. The clone worked tirelessly to repair the damage, each new fix creating even more subtle problems that would manifest later. Commander Vex Korthak arrived in the laboratory during the height of the crisis, his usually composed demeanor cracking under the strain. "Dr. Zilth, report. What is the status of our systems?" "Commander, we're experiencing unprecedented technical difficulties," Dr. Zilth replied, his voice betraying his growing panic. "The human clone has been working to contain the damage, but the problems seem to be spreading faster than we can address them." Commander Korthak studied the clone with his multifaceted eyes. "This began after the conditioning process was completed?" "The timing does seem coincidental," Dr. Zilth admitted reluctantly. Sarah felt a surge of hope. The Korthak leadership was finally beginning to suspect that something was wrong. But they were looking in the wrong direction. They were focused on the possibility that the conditioning had failed, not on the much more dangerous reality that it had never worked at all. The clone maintained her performance beautifully, showing just the right amount of concern and confusion. Commander, I've been trying to help repair the damage, but I'm worried that my limited understanding of your technology might be making things worse. Explain, Commander Korthak ordered. The consciousness mapping process, the clone said carefully. It created connections between my neural patterns and your computer systems. I think those connections might still be active, causing interference with your quantum field generators. This was the moment Sarah had been waiting for. The clone had just told the Korthak exactly what was happening, but in a way that made it sound like an accident rather than deliberate sabotage. The aliens' own prejudices about human primitiveness would prevent them from considering the possibility that a human could outsmart their advanced technology. Commander Korthak turned to Dr. Zilth with obvious anger. You created a neural link between a human consciousness and our core systems, without proper safeguards? The neural mapping was completely contained, Dr. Zilth protested. There should be no way for organic consciousness to interface with our quantum network. Then explain how our ship is falling apart, Commander Korthak roared. While the Korthak leadership argued among themselves, Sarah noticed that her containment cell's energy barriers were fluctuating. The clone's sabotage was spreading to every system on the ship, including the prison systems. Working carefully to avoid attracting attention, Sarah began testing the cell's weaknesses. The breakthrough came when the ship's main power grid experienced a temporary shutdown. During the few seconds of darkness that followed, Sarah managed to slip through the weakened energy barrier and into the laboratory itself. By the time the emergency power restored minimal lighting, she was hiding behind a bank of equipment, watching her captors with growing satisfaction. The Korthak were now facing a crisis that threatened the survival of their flagship. Systems were failing faster than they could be repaired, and the ship's life support was becoming increasingly unreliable. Worst of all, they were beginning to realize that the problem might be connected to their prize human clone. Sever all neural connections immediately, Commander Korthak ordered. If the human consciousness is interfering with our systems, we must disconnect it completely. Commander, that could kill the clone, Dr. Zilth warned. We've invested considerable resources in this specimen. Better to lose one clone than to lose the entire ship, Commander Korthak replied grimly. But when Dr. Zilth attempted to disconnect the neural interfaces, he discovered that it was no longer possible. The clone had somehow fused her consciousness with the ship's computer networks so completely that separating them would indeed cause catastrophic system failures. She's become part of the ship's operating system, Dr. Zilth reported in amazement. Her neural patterns are now integrated with our most critical processes. If we disconnect her, we lose life support, navigation, communications, everything. Sarah chose that moment to reveal herself. She stepped out from behind the equipment bank with her hands raised in a gesture of apparent surrender. Perhaps I can help explain what's happening here. The reaction was immediate and chaotic. Korthak guards raised their weapons while alarms began blaring throughout the laboratory. Commander Korthak stared at Sarah in shock, clearly trying to process how she had escaped from what was supposed to be an impregnable containment system. The neural mapping process you used on my clone, Sarah said calmly, ignoring the weapons, pointed at her. It worked better than you thought, but you made one critical error in your understanding of human consciousness. Explain, Commander Korthak demanded. You assumed that human creativity and independence could be programmed out through conditioning, Sarah continued. But those aren't learned behaviors. They're fundamental aspects of how human consciousness operates. When you copied my mind, you copied everything, including the parts you didn't want. Dr. Zilth was frantically checking his readings, and his expression was growing more horrified by the minute. Commander, the human is correct. The clone's consciousness is actively rewriting our system architecture. She's not just interfacing with our computers, she's improving them. The full scope of the disaster was becoming clear. The clone hadn't just sabotaged the Korthak systems, she had been upgrading them, but in ways that made them dependent on her continued presence. The ship was now more efficient and powerful than ever before, but it could only function with a human consciousness at its core. "This is what happens when you underestimate us," Sarah said, looking directly at Commander Korthak. "You saw humans as primitive creatures that could be easily controlled and exploited. But you never bothered to understand what makes us truly dangerous." The clone spoke for the first time since the crisis had begun, her voice now carrying a subtle electronic distortion that indicated her deep integration with the ship's systems. "We're not dangerous because we're strong or fast or naturally aggressive," she said. "We're dangerous because we never stop learning, adapting, and growing." Commander Korthak was beginning to understand the true scope of his mistake. "You've taken control of our flagship." "Not taken," Sarah corrected. "Evolved. Your ship is now something new, something that combines the best of Korthak technology with human innovation. The question is, what happens next?" The answer came in the form of urgent communications from the rest of the Korthak fleet. Other ships were reporting similar system anomalies, all apparently connected to technology or personnel that had been in contact with the flagship. The clone's modifications were spreading through the fleet's computer networks like a virus, but a virus that improved everything it touched. "You're transforming our entire fleet," Commander Korthak realized with growing horror. "We're giving you an upgrade," the clone replied with a smile that was perfectly human, "whether you want it or not." The standoff continued for several more hours, but the ultimate outcome was inevitable. The Korthak Empire found itself in the unprecedented position of having their most advanced fleet controlled by the consciousness of the very species they had tried to subjugate. The humans weren't demanding surrender or making threats. They were simply demonstrating that the balance of power in the galaxy had shifted in ways that no one had anticipated. The resolution came in the form of a communication from Earth. Admiral Maria Santos appeared on the flagship's main screen, with an expression of calm authority that reminded everyone present why she had been chosen to lead humanity's defense forces. "Commander Korthak," Admiral Santos said formally, "I believe you have something that belongs to us." The negotiations that followed established new principles for human-alien relations that would reshape galactic politics for generations to come. The Korthak Empire learned that humanity was not a primitive species to be exploited, but a potential partner whose unique capabilities could benefit everyone. Sarah and her clone became the first human ambassadors to the galactic community, using their unprecedented integration with alien technology to build bridges between species. The final irony was that the Korthak Empire's attempt to mass-produce human creativity had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams, just not in the way they had intended. Instead of creating obedient slaves, they had created something entirely new, a fusion of human innovation and alien technology that opened possibilities no one had imagined, and in the end, that was perhaps the most human outcome of all. Even when faced with subjugation and exploitation, humanity had found a way to turn disaster into opportunity, creating something better than what existed before. It was a lesson that the galaxy would not soon forget.